Okay, here we go for the second video of the year. This one's going to be about electrons because they're really important, and like it says here, it's always all about the electron, except for when it isn't, and we'll talk about that later. So electrons, why they are so important in particular is because every chemical reaction that takes place in the known universe outside of nuclear reactions, right? Because those are dealing with the nucleus, that's why they are nuclear. But everything outside of a nuclear reaction is a result of the movement and interactions of electrons, right? They do great things like provide us with electricity, because electricity really, all it is a flow of electrons. They're responsible for the element's chemical reactivity, or lack thereof, right? They make it possible for life to exist by storing energy in the form of chemical bonds, right? Hopefully you remember from biology talking about glucose and cellular respiration, right? Photosynthesis. Plants build glucose to store the energy from the sun. They use it, we use it. When we break it down and get that energy back out of the chemical bonds. So electrons, really important. Hopefully this will look familiar, right? You kind of saw this in the last video. We saw this during the week last week. I'm sure you'll see this again, but here we go. The basic structure of an atom, right? Rings representing energy levels. These lovely rings, energy levels. And each energy level holds a certain number of subshells and orbitals, right? Like I said in the last video, the subshells, we have S, P, D, F. There are the 4 blocks of the periodic table that are named after those subshells, right? And so that is telling you something about the electronic structure of the atom based on the subshell and the block that it's in. And each subshell holds a particular number of orbitals. Don't worry, right now we will get to that. And then an orbital, right? Specifically, the orbitals are where the electrons are held, and any one orbital can only hold a maximum of 2 electrons. So you'll never have an orbital that has more than 2 electrons, right? So the basic structure is that you have energy levels, however I spell levels, erase that. It's a basic structure. Start again here. Energy levels, right? So there's energy levels. Inside energy levels, there are subshells, right? And inside those subshells are orbitals, right? And held in the orbitals are the electrons, right? So going from largest to smallest, right? The electrons way down in those orbitals. So that is basically the structure of where the electrons are held, right? Going from the largest energy levels down to the subshells. And then in the subshells, there are orbitals, and in those orbitals are the electrons. So what do orbitals actually look like? This one's just for fun. Don't really worry about this too much. But this is a XYZ plane, and so it's more or less representing it in 3 dimensions. These are the basic shapes of orbitals. And what this is as I explained in a couple classes last week when people were asking about it, that basically this is shapes that come out of a bunch of really complex mathematics. They're telling you where most likely you are going to find an electron based on its wave function. So this is what the orbitals actually look like, where you are most likely to find an electron around the nucleus. So you can always imagine the nucleus just kind of being at the center of each of these, somewhere right in there, and that you've got this crazy three-dimensional stuff going on around the nucleus where the electrons are existing. Don't worry too much about this. I just kind of wanted to show you what the orbitals actually look like that are around the nucleus. And so here we go. The number, right, that's like along the side of the periodic table. Let me draw for a second. This were the periodic table, right? All of you are like, whoa, that looks just like the periodic table. I've had a lot of practice drawing it. Right? We've got hydrogen, helium, all the rest of the stuff here. And you've got some numbers along the side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, like that. So the number that's along the side here really is telling you the energy level that the atoms in that row, right, row going across, have their outermost electrons in. All right, so silicon, because its outermost electrons are the last electrons that it has here on the third energy level, you know that it's going to be in the third row here, and actually it's right about there. So looking at this, right, looking at this diagram, the number here represents the energy level, the letter represents the subshell. Again, like I said, notice these are the same as the blocks of the periodic table. Each of these boxes represents an orbital, and the arrows, right, represent electrons. So this is another way to represent where electrons are and represent that whole structure that I just talked about on the last slide. All right, so we've got energy levels, we've got subshells, we've got orbitals, we've got electrons, right? So this is also another way where we've got energy level, subshell, electron. They just don't have the orbital in this one. The orbitals are not expressly shown in this, but they are still there. Okay, so why I'm showing you this, right, is to talk about whether or not we fill orbitals, because that's going to have a lot to do with how reactive an element is, right? So for orbitals, completely filled, something like neon down here, right? If you look, every orbital is filled with 2 electrons, right? And if you remember, any orbital can only hold 2 electrons. Completely empty, right? Like beryllium here. Got all these orbitals that are completely empty. Or when you have each half filled, right? Nitrogen, we look, there's only 1 electron in each of these orbitals. That means that that particular subshell, its orbitals are half full, right? These are the most stable configurations. So the most stable configurations are going to be completely empty, completely full, and half full. And in fact, completely full is definitely the most stable, right? So anything that has its orbital is completely full, that's going to be the most stable. All right, so a totally full energy level. In the case of neon, right, if we look at the ones that have 2, right, it's completely full here. Second energy level is totally full. That is a very stable configuration for atoms. So they will not lose or gain. They will not lose or gain electrons, right, in order to fill or empty their outermost energy level. So all these others, right, when you're very close to having an either completely full or completely empty outermost energy level, that's when something's very reactive, right? If we look at lithium, right, there's one electron in its second energy level, right? Because if we're looking at second energy level, there's only one electron. That's really close to having a completely empty second energy level, all right? So this one is going to want to get rid of that electron, so this is completely empty, right? That means lithium is extremely reactive. On the other hand, if we look at fluorine, right, in its second energy level, it only needs one more electron here to have a completely full outer energy level, which means it is also going to be extremely reactive, but it wants to pull an electron in, right, so that it can have a full outer energy level. That means fluorine is extremely reactive, right? So that is why I go through and actually look at how the electrons are set up here, so that we know that when something is wanting to only give up one or maybe two electrons, it's going to be pretty reactive. Same goes for if it only wants to take in one or maybe two electrons. Those are also going to be quite reactive. This stuff in the middle here, right, definitely not nearly as reactive. And then we've got things that have their outer energy level completely full, and those are not going to be reactive at all. All right, so this is what I was just talking about. This is why elements like lithium and fluorine are extremely reactive, as they only need to gain or lose one electron to be full, while elements like neon are completely unreactive because they are already full and so will not take or give electrons. Right? They have just as many as they want. So this is something, and I will show you a demo when we were back in school about electrons moving energy levels, right? So electrons can be excited or bumped up into higher energy orbitals or energy levels when they absorb energy from a photon. What is a photon? Basically, it is a particle of light. So photon equals particle of light. Oh, I have it written right here. Great. Photon, single particle of light, or electromagnetic radiation. We'll talk about that later. Another way to excite them is with a high energy electron bumping into it. So if you have some electron here that's high energy, it comes and it bumps into this particular atom, one of the electrons here, that can also cause an excitation. And then to the other way, thermal excitation. So let's say you got some nice fire going on here, right? The great looking fire. Of course, we got to put the logs in there, right? So you've got fire. It's going to send heat energy here. And that's going to also be able to move electrons from one energy level to the next. So then, once the electron is in an excited state, right, it's not going to be able to stay there for very long. And so what happens is it releases energy. All right, so it's going to send that energy back out after it's been in that excited state. It moves back down to what's called its ground state, and it's going to release the energy back out, usually in the form of some sort of electromagnetic radiation. Sometimes it will release it in the range of radiation that we see as visible light. And so when it goes back down to its ground state, it will release some sort of visible light. So that's pretty cool. We'll definitely be able to see that in a demo. And that is electron excitation. So when we're talking about electrons, things to remember: that electrons are responsible for all chemical reactions outside of nuclear reactions. Electrons are held in orbitals around the nucleus. They're responsible for the chemical properties and reactivity of each element, right? And this is the really big one, right? That electrons are what is doing the chemistry when we talk about chemistry. And that they are really helpful for us because they can store and release chemical energy through the making and breaking of chemical bonds. I don't know why "in" is there. So they can store and release chemical energy through the making or breaking of chemical bonds. Okay, so that is where we're going to stop with electrons. Again, we'll see a demo related to some of this when we get back to school. If you have any questions, please let me know. And make sure you check out the assignments that I have up on Canvas.